The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
Welcome back to our study of the book of Romans. In the previous video, we began a side-by-side analysis of justification by faith versus justification by the works of the law. Those who believed they achieved righteousness through the accumulation of good works tended toward a self-righteousness which manifested itself in things like boasting. Paul argues justification cannot be found in keeping the law of Moses. The law condemns all who are unable to perfectly observe it. Therefore, everyone is condemned and no one is just in the eyes of God. If justification can only be found in keeping the law, where do faithful Gentiles fit? Is God not their God as well? For these reasons, you just cannot be justified by keeping the law of Moses. Justification must come through faith. How else could Abraham, who lived 4 centuries before the law was revealed, attain righteousness? Abraham was an obedient servant, but his works were far from perfect in the final analysis. Like all of us, the sum total of Abraham's deeds and the standard by which God judges the world were separated by a significant gap. In this respect, Abraham serves as a forerunner, a prototype of the servant which God seeks. A servant whose sincere but imperfect obedience is rooted in a deep, abiding faith in God. Put quite simply, our faith, by God's grace, covers the gap between our imperfections and God's righteousness. Which brings us to chapter 4, verse number 9. Does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. How then was it accounted? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. Before we focus closely on this section, let's zoom out to see the broader message. Back in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, Paul says that belief in the gospel of Jesus saves Jew and Gentile alike from the wrath of God. The prevailing trajectory among both Jews and Gentiles was away from God. With no means of justification available, the whole world was condemned. In response, God set forth his Son as a propitiation for the world's sins. Jesus was God's gift to the world, and his sacrifice is the grace of God in action. Faith in Jesus, and not in the works of the law, grants us access to the grace of God. Because justification is by faith, it is available to the circumcised and uncircumcised, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. To prove that God has granted universal access to his grace by faith, Paul reminds us of a key piece from the narrative of Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, God calls Abraham to leave his family and his homeland behind and to take up the life of a nomad in a foreign land. Abraham obeys, he goes to Canaan, and seeks refuge in Egypt during a famine. In Genesis 13, Abraham returns to Canaan. He and Lot go their separate ways, and God reiterates his promise to give Abraham and his descendants this land. In Genesis chapter 14, Lot is kidnapped. Abraham amasses an army, defeats a coalition of kings, and meets Melchizedek in ancient Jerusalem. In Genesis 15, God promises to give Abraham an heir from his own body. He tells Abraham his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. And Abraham believed the Lord, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Genesis 15:6. Genesis chapter 16, Abraham fathers a child, Ishmael, by Hagar, Sarah's servant. Hagar's pregnancy creates friction in the household. And in Genesis 17, Abraham is given the sign of circumcision. Paul calls attention to Abraham's demonstration of his faithfulness to God long before he received the sign of circumcision. As Paul says, how then was Abraham's righteousness accounted? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised. Some rabbis theorized Abraham kept the entirety of the law, therefore he was justified by his adherence to the yet-to-be-revealed law of Moses. Though this theory was popular, it contradicts the Genesis narrative. The moment God justified Abraham, Genesis 15:6, happened more than 13 years before the sign of circumcision was given. So even the work of circumcision did not make Abraham righteous. God already considered Abraham a righteous man by virtue of his faith. To be perfectly clear, an uncircumcised man was justified by faith apart from the works of the law, and that man happens to be Abraham. By drawing out Abraham's justification by faith prior to receiving circumcision, Paul has in one way supported his earlier claim that the law was established by faith. Chapter 3, verse 31. Continuing on in verse 11. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also, and the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised. The fact God justified Abraham by faith as an uncircumcised man places him in a very special position. He becomes the father of all those who believe. Abraham blazed the trail to justification by faith for the Gentile. The uncircumcised can have a relationship with God and be a part of his people if he or she believes. More on that in just a moment. For the circumcised, they must walk in the steps of faith of their biological father Abraham. And notice that Paul does not challenge the necessity of circumcision or obedience to the law. Rather, he says circumcision must be preceded by faith. The absence of faith in keeping the law was the failure, and the absence of faith meant law-abiders could not be justified. In chapter 3, the writer of Hebrews reflects on the rebellious generation who refused to invade Canaan. Why did these folks stubbornly refuse the will of God? Because of an evil heart of unbelief. They were hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. They could not enter because of unbelief. Verses 12, 13, and 19. The writer of Hebrews claims, "For indeed the gospel was preached to us as well as to them." How did a generation 1400 years before Christ hear the gospel? Well, the conquering of Canaan was a part of God's promise to Abraham. In your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So in that sense, the command to take the land was a part of the good news. The inheritance of Canaan also prefigures the inheritance that awaits us in Jesus Christ. But the writer of Hebrews says that the word, the gospel, which they heard, did not profit them. They were hearers of the word and not doers. As Paul notes in Romans chapter 2, verse 13, "For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified." And what made them hearers but not doers? A heart of unbelief. As the English Standard Version says, they were not united by faith with those who listened. There was a small number of people there who had faith, who did believe, but those who rebelled did not share that faith. So what was lacking among the rebels? It was faith in God. Faith, or as Paul says, they did not walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised. Faith was the missing ingredient. Hard-heartedness and the lack of faith led to rebellion. Therefore, this generation was condemned to wander and to die in the wilderness. As I noted a couple of minutes ago, Paul says that the uncircumcised, if they walk by faith, can become children of Abraham. This ties back to the conclusion in chapter 2, verses 26 through 29. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you who, even with your written code and circumcision, are a transgressor of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God. Those who lived without the law and yet believed in God and acted accordingly shamed the lawbreakers. They were more Jewish than actual Jews. Why? Because true circumcision is of the heart. It's a matter of faith and faithfulness to God. Outward circumcision, Paul says, is a sign, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which Abraham had while still uncircumcised. Abraham's heart was circumcised when God accounted his faith for righteousness. The physical act of circumcision manifested what had already taken place within. The uncircumcised can become children of Abraham by following a similar pattern. Circumcise the heart by believing in Jesus Christ. Make the inward circumcision manifest in how we live, or as Paul says, walk in Abraham's steps of faith. Regardless of our lineage, everyone can become a child of Abraham if we share his faith and live that faith out in our lives. Let's continue on in verse number 13. For the promise that he would be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void and the promise made of no effect, because the law brings about wrath. For where there is no law, there is no transgression. God promised an inheritance to Abraham long before the law was ever given. The inheritance was he would be the heir of the world. This is from Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. The promise was made a quarter century before Abraham was circumcised, which, remember, serves as a representation of the law. And the promise was made through the righteousness of faith. But wait a second. God did not recognize Abraham's faith until a decade after the promised inheritance. How can Paul say the promise was given in response to Abraham's faith? Well, divine foresight is one possible answer. God will touch on that in verse number 17. God who calls those things which do not exist as though they did. That's James's argument in James chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. Abraham offering Isaac on the altar, which happened years later, fulfilled God's justification of Abraham by faith. So it's possible to see the promised inheritance as prospective. God foresaw the moment of Abraham's justification by faith and promised the blessing accordingly. But a more simple answer is found in Genesis 12, verse number 4. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him. The writer of Hebrews observed, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. Abraham's faith was manifest long before God accounted it to him for righteousness. So in a sense, God justifying Abraham by faith was both prospective, who he would be in the future, and retrospective, who he had already been in the past. Regardless, Abraham's inheritance, in you all the nations of the world would be blessed, was promised by virtue of the righteousness of faith centuries before the law was given and over a decade before circumcision was commanded. So if the promise was made to an uncircumcised man, then it seems reasonable to conclude that the uncircumcised could be partakers of the promise regardless of their biological descent. Paul insists this must be the case. The promise cannot be limited to those who keep the law. In this section, Paul demonstrates the law was established on faith, specifically the faith of Abraham. Therefore, those who kept the law should walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised, verse number 12. But as I noted in past videos, faith was not required to keep the law. Paul says in Galatians 3:12, yet the law is not of faith, but the man who does them shall live by them. Under the old law, life was secured by perfect obedience, regardless of one's faith. Following the law was not a matter of what do you believe, it was a matter of what have you done. Strictly following the law led many to believe the blessings of Abraham were secured by merit. The faith of Abraham was absent. If the promise made to Abraham came through the law and not through faith, the promise was effectively nullified because the law brings about wrath. What Paul argues in chapter 4, verses 14 and 15 is essentially a recapitulation of what he says back in chapter 3, verses 19 and 20. The law, specifically the morality codified by the law, fully revealed sin, its magnitude, and its consequences. For where there is no law, there is no transgression. This effectively condemned the world, that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. The law sufficiently defined sin, but it did not offer a sufficient means of justification, thus trapping the world in condemnation with no hope of escape. The law brings about wrath. But the inheritance promised to Abraham was a blessing, not a curse. How could the same stream, the law, bring forth blessing and cursing? It stands to reason, then, that the blessing of Abraham must issue from some other stream. It came from someplace else other than the law. Long before either the law was given or Abraham was circumcised, God promised to bless the world through him. He promised this by virtue of Abraham's faith. And that brings us to verses 16 and 17. Therefore it is of faith, that it might be according to grace, so that the promise might be sure to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations, in the presence of him whom he believed, God who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did. Before we dive into these verses, let's take a moment to retrace the steps which led us to this point. The law cannot justify, it can only condemn, which means we can only be justified by faith. As God says through Habakkuk, the just shall live by faith. If faith and not the law justifies man in the sight of God, then justification must be available to circumcised and uncircumcised alike. Does righteousness by faith nullify the law? No, the law is established on faith, specifically the faith of Abraham. Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. God considered Abraham righteous on the basis of his faith, not the works of the law. Thus, he did not owe Abraham justification. God justified Abraham 13 years before he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And speaking more broadly, Abraham was justified by faith in spite of his deeds, which were, like all of us, imperfect in the final analysis. So the law is established on the bedrock of justification by faith, specifically the faith of Abraham. The promise of an inheritance, in you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, was also given by virtue of his faith. The promise was given long before Abraham was circumcised, and the promise cannot come through the law. The law condemns the entire world, sentencing us all to God's wrath. Since the blessing cannot come through the law, it must come by virtue of faith. And because the promise was made in response to Abraham's faith, it extends to everyone who shares Abraham's faith. This is Paul's conclusion in verse 16. Therefore it is of faith, that it might be according to grace, so that the promise might be sure to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. To emphasize the role of grace, Paul draws out the miraculous elements contained in the promises to Abraham. God who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did. Sarah, Abraham's wife, was barren. At 75, when God's call was first issued in Genesis 12, the couple had no children from which God could make Abraham a great nation. When Abraham attempts to negotiate with God by offering a substitute in chapter 15, verse 3. Look, you've given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is an heir. He's negotiating with God. The word of the Lord comes to Abraham in a response. This one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. Then God brought him outside and said, Look now toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them. And he said to him, So shall your descendants be. God in his foreknowledge was calling those things which do not exist as though they did. Abraham attempted to father an heir through Hagar by human effort. One might say he attempted to obtain the promise by works, but it was God's will to revive the womb of Sarah and brought an heir into the world by miraculous means. Or to put it another way, the heir was brought into the world by God's grace. Notice the pattern established by God with Abraham. God calls Abraham. When calling Abraham, God, through foreknowledge, makes a promise impossible to achieve by human means. Abraham believes the promise and is thereby justified. God fulfills the promise by his grace, independent of human effort or capability. Because the promise is given by God's grace in response to Abraham's faith, it is made sure to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. Later on in Romans chapter 9, verses 25 and 26, Paul quotes from Hosea 2:23 and 1:20. I will call them my people who were not my people, and her beloved who was not beloved. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, You are not my people, there they shall be called the sons of the living God. Those who were not God's people, God through foreknowledge predicted he would call them sons of the living God. Paul's statement in chapter 4, verse 17 is a subtle recapitulation of what God predicts in Hosea. God who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did. Just as God expressed his grace by reviving the womb of Sarah, so too God adopting the Gentiles as a part of his family is an expression of God's grace. And he did so through his foreknowledge. And you he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sins. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Just as he revived the womb of Sarah, so too God adopted the Gentiles, the dead Gentiles, dead in trespasses and sins, as a part of his family. And this is an expression of God's grace. Thus it is of faith that it might be according to grace, so that the promise might be sure to all the seed. Abraham, by virtue of God's grace, becomes the father of all of us who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. By drawing out Abraham's justification by faith prior to receiving circumcision, Paul has in one way supported his earlier claim that the law was established by faith. Regardless of our lineage, everyone can become a child of Abraham if we share his faith. Long before the law was given, or Abraham was circumcised, God promised to bless the world through him. He promised this by virtue of Abraham's faith. Abraham, by virtue of God's grace, becomes the father of all of us who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek.